I think that's a question we all end up answering at some point in our lives. There are thousands of quotes out there about failure, and you've probably heard something like, no one has ever been successful without failing a few times, and I 100% believe that that's true. Every pilot has to grapple with at least the thought of failure at some point. It could be as simple as you get a maneuver wrong during a training session, or it could be a checkride failure perhaps. But to become a pilot, you have to be tested in specific skills and knowledge areas, and if you want to make a career out of it, you're going to be tested multiple times throughout your life. And with that comes the chance of failure. This video is going to touch on a lot of topics regarding failure in aviation, particularly from the professional pilot perspective. So if you are a professional in the field and you've maybe failed a check ride or are going through some sort of failure event, I'd highly recommend that you stick around. The entire purpose of this channel has always been to show you guys my journey through aviation, and this video is probably going to be the most personal video I've ever made. With that being said, my name is Jerdao, you're watching AV868, and I'd like to tell you a story. Some of my earliest memories have to do with aviation. Ever since I could remember, all I've ever wanted to be was a pilot. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when I fell in love with aviation, but it was probably when we would fly back and forth between the US and Trinidad, where my parents would ask the cabin crew if I could go into the cockpit for a little bit and chat with the pilots. We would do this a lot, and over time I began actually dressing up as a pilot and whatnot. I think the flight crew back then would get a kick out of that. But I remember being in the cockpit, and even from that young of an age, I was so mesmerized by all the lights and the switches. I remember thinking to myself, I wanted to know what every one of those switches did. I wanted to learn how to fly these airplanes. So that became my goal. I started teaching myself how to fly using Microsoft Flight Simulator 2000.
Well, hello. I'm John King.
And I'm Martha King.
Welcome to the exciting world of flying, brought to you by Microsoft Flight Simulator 2000.
I would sit for hours and try to figure out how to take off and land. It started off slow because I wasn't paying attention to any foundational principles of flying. It was really just trial and error. I'd load up on Meigs Field in a Cessna 172, put the power in, and start flying that plane. Eventually, I figured out what a stall was. I figured out how to fly a stabilized-ish approach and land the airplane back on Meigs Field. After that, I started working my way up. I would go into the 737 and do the same thing with that jet. I remember back then, Microsoft Flight Sim had the 777, and that was a fun plane to fly. It's still one of my favorite aircraft to this day, and I hope I do get the opportunity to fly one in the future. That would be a true full circle moment. Anyway, after spending countless hours on Flight Simulator 2000 and then later on Flight Gear, Flight Simulator X, and then X-Plane 11, I finally got the opportunity to take my first small airplane ride at around 12 years old. Now for me, this was basically a dream come true. It was the moment that I had been waiting for all these years, and I channeled everything that I had learned on the simulator into the stick and rudder of that Piper Super Cruiser that I was flying. Now that day was a day that I will obviously never forget, just because of how awesome it was to finally fly an airplane. But it was also a defining moment that really made it clear that I had to become a pilot. Because of all the airline flying that I did growing up, I knew that I liked flying in airplanes. But it was after this flight that I became extremely aware that I had to figure out a way to turn this dream into a reality. So I decided I'd keep on studying airplane stuff, that is. I wasn't particularly exceptional at my actual schoolwork. I mean, I averaged A's and B's, but it wasn't like I was a straight 4.0 student. I just got super fixated on the flying stuff. I remember I would come home from school and pretty much instantly hop on flight gear with my friends and start flying around the world with them. I worked my way up to being able to do advanced formation maneuvers, and a friend and I, who I'm still in contact with, actually started a flight demonstration team, which was a first for the flight gear community. We would pretend to put on air shows and record videos and whatnot, and there's actually still a trailer for this flight demonstration team available on my channel. I never took it down, and I was kind of just sitting in wait trying to figure out what route I was going to take to actually start flying and become a pilot. Now, thankfully, I didn't have to do all the figuring out on my own. My mentor, who had taken me on that first small airplane ride all those years ago, had continued to help guide me on my path to becoming a pilot. We would fly together whenever we could, and he would continue to teach me what he knew on those flights. Even though he wasn't a certified flight instructor, this was a huge deal because it helped me build that real-world feel for how an aircraft flies, as well as get the muscle memory down in terms of things like running checklists, performing the pre-flight inspection, and stuff like that. It allowed me to just get a hands-on experience with the aircraft, and as much as I love the simulators, that hands-on stuff just cannot be replicated fully in a simulator. Pretty soon I was in my final year of high school at 17. All this while I kept at it with the simulator as well as with the real world flying here and there, but I also began to get involved in a cool thing known as the EAA, or Experimental Aircraft Association. My local EAA chapter would host flying events and I'd try to help out whenever I could. It was around this time in 2020 that we began hearing about an organization known as the Ray Aviation Foundation. The Ray Aviation Foundation would give out these scholarships to kids within the age bracket to go out and get their private pilot certificate. And my chapter was gracious enough to apply for that scholarship and then put me forward as the scholarship applicant. And to my honest amazement, I was awarded the 2020 Ray Aviation Scholarship. Now this was absolutely huge. The cost of flight training was one of the things that genuinely kept me up at night because I had to figure out how I was going to pay for this stuff, and the scholarship could not have come in at a better time. Now I was locked in and ready to go. I was ready to put all that flight sim experience and the little flying experience I had to use towards getting this rating, and I had just gotten the financial green light, so to speak, to do so. As they say, it was go time. I felt ready to fly and ready to learn. I wasn't like nervous or anything, and I wasn't really too stumped by anything that was being thrown at me because I sort of had a mental picture of what to expect already. I will say the one tough part in the whole process was the written test. I really scrambled through the studying for the written test and I managed to pass with an 80%, but that was definitely nothing to be proud of, and I felt as if the people around me were expecting more. I know I was expecting more of myself. I pushed on through though, and about 30 days since the start of my training, I was deemed ready for the check ride. So we scheduled the check ride. Now, the private pilot check ride didn't really go as well as I thought it would go. Going into the check ride, I felt pretty prepared, but I think it was just the fact that it was my first check ride. I didn't really appreciate exactly what I was getting into, and I'll explain that in a second. On top of that, my DP just so happened to be an ex-Top Gun instructor pilot, so he really grilled my stuff. I'm not saying that as an excuse by any means. I should have known the stuff that he was asking off the top of my head, but I just didn't. Anyway, the oral portion of the check ride was pretty difficult to me. I think it took us like 4 hours to get through everything, and I was stumbling through it. I mean, he would ask a question and I would just have to say, hey, I don't quite know the answer, I need to look that up. And this was happening over and over again. It honestly got to the point where I just thought I was not gonna pass this oral today. At some point he was gonna tell me that I would have to come back and do it again. But by some miracle, I guess my stumbling through the questions wasn't quite at the threshold where he felt he needed to cut off the check ride, so I managed to squeeze by and pass the ground portion of my oral. But this left a lasting impression on me. From this point on, I was going to be over prepared for every single check ride I did. I think another factor that played into this was just the fact that I was pushing through this private pilot syllabus. I didn't really give myself enough time to study for the ground stuff. I just took the written test, studied the FARs a little bit, and called it a day. I think I remember doing one mock oral with my instructor, but that was pretty much it. Anyway, this fundamentally changed how I would view check rides in the future and how I would prepare for them as well. The flight portion of the check ride did go a lot better than the oral portion. There was still some minor stuff that I managed to mess up, but overall I did pretty good. So we took off out of the airport and went through all the maneuvers, power on, power off stalls, all of that stuff. After completing all of that, he decided to have me perform a simulated engine out maneuver, so we simulated the engine failing, and I managed to pick an airport and land at the airport, completing my simulated engine out performance. So that all went pretty good. From that point, we decided to work on our landings at that airport that I chose, which was suitable. So we did our normal landing, soft field landing, short field landing, and we did the associated takeoffs as well. I think it was my soft field landing that he actually had me do one more lap around and try again, and it was because that soft field landing was not very soft at all. So I knew that I could do it again, and I was happy that he gave me another chance. I know some DPs that would do that differently, but I did get another chance to do that and managed to make a really nice soft field landing on the second one, but felt kind of bad about that. I think that was the only major thing that I messed up in terms of the landings. We decided to head back to the airport after that. I guess he decided he'd seen enough. And on the way back, we did some navigation stuff. So he asked me to turn off my iPad, pull out the sectional chart, and find my location and point to my exact location when I was confident of where I was. So I took some time. I decided to tune in the local VOR that we were nearest to and find what radial I was on, and then I cross-referenced that with some railroad tracks that I saw that we were flying over, and I was able to actually, with pinpoint accuracy, point to where we were. So I was actually pretty proud of that, and he was, I think, impressed with that as well. As I got closer to the airport, I realized that I was apparently having some kind of radio trouble. ATC could hear me, but I could not hear their response, and that was causing some confusion regarding whether I was cleared into the airspace to land or not. I ended up asking for a light gun signal, and I did get the light gun signal, so I landed at the airport on a light gun signal, and on final, I finally heard faintly that I was cleared to land. But I tried everything. I mean, I tried the volume knobs, of course, that's the first thing I went for, switching the comm, from comm 1 to comm 2. I just couldn't solve it in the air, and it was never really clear to me exactly what I was doing wrong there, but we made it work with the light gun signal, and when we got on the ground, I taxied back to our parking spot. Now, this was the moment of truth. I never heard the words that I failed the check ride, but what ended up happening was the DP just calmly exited the aircraft as soon as I shut down. He didn't say a word to me at all, and so I just secured the airplane, preparing for the worst pretty much. I was super nervous, and when I finally walked into the room where he was at, he was sitting at his desk and he just calmly said, "Congratulations, you're now a private pilot." And I was astonished. I was fully prepared for him to say, "Yeah, we're gonna have to do that again." Because I was just so nervous with how everything was going. I forgot to mention too that for the first time ever, I forgot to remove my chocks on this flight. Now, I caught it before starting the engine because I was running through my checklist. And the funny thing is, the only time I've ever forgotten to pull chocks has been on my private and, funnily enough, on my instrument check ride. For the commercial and for the CFI and subsequent training, I have finally stopped making that mistake. But it just goes to show that I am not a perfect pilot, and I think this private pilot check ride made me really realize that. I was listening to a podcast, Pilot to Pilot podcast, shout out Justin, if he happens to be watching, but one of the things that the interviewee said was basically that the pilots, or the private pilot's license, is a license to learn. Like, you really know nothing when you first get that private pilot's license, and it's amazing how, really in respect to all the other training, how little training is actually required to just get the private pilot's license. In the moment, it might seem like a lot. I mean, there's so much going on, there's so much to learn. But if you've gotten your private, then you've definitely experienced this. Those first few hours where you're solo in the aircraft and acting under your new private pilot certificate typically are the hours where you learn the most about yourself and how you handle different situations, provided that you actually go out and do stuff, you're not just flying around the pattern every time you go fly. For me, I got super lucky. After getting the private, I was able to go out and execute cross countries on my own, kind of in the local area there, and I learned so much from that experience about planning a trip, executing the trip, and making diversions if necessary where things exceeded my personal minimums. It was really a great learning experience, but when I really started feeling comfortable in aircraft was honestly when I was going towards my commercial certificate. This is a little bit of a tangent, but when I started going for the commercial, I started thinking about flying from a really big picture, holistic aspect. For example, when planning a flight, instead of just looking at the route from point A to point B, I started asking myself this simple question: what is the biggest threat on this flight that I was about to conduct? Sometimes it would be fuel, sometimes it would be the time of the day, sometimes it would be terrain considerations, but I found that when I would look at the flight from this big picture perspective and kind of a top-down approach, I really got into the mindset of how I was going to execute this flight while minimizing my risk, and I think that was super helpful for me. So anyway, circling back to the original point, after completing the private pilot check ride, I knew that I had a lot left to learn, and I started that learning process. Having this private pilot experience and this near brush with failure was really all in all a good thing for my mental state, and it really came to shape how I would view myself as a pilot, kind of destroyed some of the ego that I had going into it as a student pilot, and it would also shape a little bit of how I viewed and studied for future check rides. The key thing that I took away was that I needed to study harder on the ground stuff and on regulations. Essentially, I needed to over-prepare for the oral portion. And in general, I just didn't know as much as I thought I knew. I continued to carry this mentality with me, and when it was time for the instrument check ride, I was indeed over-prepared for the oral portion as well as the flight portion. The instrument check ride was amazing. It went really well. A lot of people say that it's one of the hardest check rides to do because it's just so much new material compared to what you were doing for your private, but I honestly really loved it. The simulator flying that I did helped a lot because I transitioned from flying VFR in the simulator to pretty much only doing IFR flights. And I would say to this day, when I'm on the simulator, there's a 99% chance that I'm on an IFR flight plan practicing IFR stuff for proficiency. I just don't get a lot of joy in flying VFR anymore on the simulator because, you know, that's what I do in real life. I do have very little actual instrument time, and that's something that I need to work on. But anyway, the instrument check ride went great. The oral portion was smooth, and I felt like I really knew my stuff. The flight portion went amazing, and he had some minor tips for me on how I conducted my partial panel approach, but it was just nothing close to the sense that I had on the private pilot check ride, where it felt like at every moment I was inches away from a failure. And that made me feel really good. It made me feel like the private pilot check ride was kind of just a one-off thing, and was probably just due to the fact that it was my first check ride. The commercial check ride also went great. The commercial check ride was probably one of the smoothest check rides I've ever done. It was super easy. The oral portion was honestly super fun. I gotta give props to the DPE because it honestly felt like I was just having a conversation with a guy who knew aviation stuff. It felt like I was talking to a peer, and that was really cool to experience in a check ride. I think there was one question here, either on the instrument or the commercial, where he asked about what kind of oxygen was required. If you were to use supplemental oxygen, and this is kind of a tangent, but I sort of forgot that it had to be aviation grade oxygen. So that was the one thing I sort of messed up. You know, still, even though it went super great, there's always room for improvement. But all in all, the check rides went great. Like I was saying, for the commercial check ride, I really started to get into that holistic view of flying. And I think that really helped in the check ride, just really viewing the flight from a top-down perspective. Like, what are the objectives? What are the safety threats? And how are we now going to execute this flight to a commercial standard where we now have potential passengers to please and passengers that may be forcing us into a bad spot if they have things like time requirements or weight requirements, for example. All of these scenarios sort of came up naturally during the check ride, and I think he appreciated me going on a deep dive into these scenarios and talking about what I would potentially do to still complete the flight, even though we may have to maybe reschedule, shift some weight around. But really, the last thing you want to do is cancel the flight on your passengers unless it was a really safety critical thing. And I think, at least for me, I got the sense that that was what the commercial check ride was really all about. It was about how are you gonna handle these commercial scenarios where you have passengers pushing you or you have a company behind you pushing you. Anyway, another tangent, back to the story. The flight portion of the commercial check ride too was like a non-event. The maneuvers went nicely. The only thing that I kind of was worried about was the power off 180 landing. I think every commercial applicant is a little bit scared of the power off 180 maneuver, where basically you have to cut the power when you're right abeam the numbers, or the numbers on the runway, I should emphasize, and you basically fly the aircraft down to the runway with no engine thrust being generated. So you have to just use the geometry of your approach. You have to maybe add drag with flaps or with a side slip, but you cannot add power like you normally would in any normal approach to make the runway. You just have to instinctively hit your mark using the energy that's remaining in the aircraft. So I was nervous about this power off 180, and of course we saved it for last, like literally the last thing we had to do on the check ride. When it was time to execute it though, I pulled the power and I ended up slipping the aircraft with no flaps because I wanted to kind of maintain the ability to remove the slip if I needed to, whereas some instructor or some examiners kind of frown on you if you take flaps out once you put them in. So I wanted to just slip, and I ended up slipping it really nicely, landed on the 1,000-footers, and breathed a sigh of relief because I was now a commercial pilot after that one maneuver was done. Now, with both the instrument and the commercial check rides complete, it was finally time to start thinking about that CFI check ride. If you guys have been watching this channel for a while, and even if you're kind of a newcomer, you'll still detect that this channel sort of has a undertone of educational aviation to it. And that's always been sort of intentional. I've always wanted to treat the channel as a way for, in the beginning, a way for me to recap my flights and really dive into what went right, what went wrong, and try to learn from the experience. I always knew that at some point I'd need to get the CFI certificate because, well, it would make me a certified flight instructor. And with that, I would be able to actually broadcast this knowledge without the fear that I was just some dumb private commercial pilot, just kind of saying words. I always was really cautious about this. I did not want to emphasize that I was teaching anything until I got that CFI certificate. And if you guys have noticed, I stopped putting up the disclaimer that my videos are purely for my recap and for my own personal review since I got that CFI certificate. I tried to be very careful about that. I didn't want people to get the wrong idea when they were watching my videos thinking that I was trying to teach them something when I was in fact not a certified teacher. So in order to become a certified flight instructor, there's a few things that you have to do. One of the things is completing 2 written exams instead of the usual 1 per check ride. The 2 exams you have to complete are the Fundamentals of Instruction written exam and the Flight Instructor Airplane written exam. A lot of people describe the fundamentals of instruction as the sort of psychology of teaching and learning. There's a lot of human behavior stuff in here, and the cool thing about it is it doesn't always apply to just aviation. It can also apply to if you're going to a new job and you have to learn stuff there, or even if you're in a managerial position and you have to be the one teaching new people. All of this stuff is kind of pertinent to that sort of dynamic between maybe a student or a learner and an instructor. Now, some people hate the FOI stuff and some people really like it. It really depends on who you are as a person. But regardless, if you're going to become a certified flight instructor, you have to know it. And I think it's really cool because you kind of learn how people naturally are, how people's brains work, and that stuff is really important when you're actually going to become any sort of instructor. So if you are a certified flight instructor in training, don't leave the FOIs behind. Pay attention to the fundamentals of instruction and actually learn how people work, and it's going to make you a better instructor. Anyway, moving on. For me, I thought the written test on the fundamentals of instruction was actually not that difficult. I remember I started studying for that test in I think November of 2023, and I managed to take and pass the test in December of 2023, and I got a 94% on that one. On January 2nd of 2024, I took and passed the flight instructor airplane test, and I got a 97% on that test, which I was pretty happy with. Now, it took me a little bit of time to actually start gearing up for completing the CFI training. In between January and June, I just continued to do a bunch of fun flying. I did the Hayward Air Rally in June, and funnily enough, that's where I would meet someone who would be instrumental in helping me get my CFI. At the Hayward Air Rally, I met someone who was also participating in the event, who happened to be a CFI that was instructing out of a flight school in Sacramento. I had already been thinking about doing the CFI training at this particular flight school in Sacramento, and he basically was a contact there that gave me a lot of insight into what it would actually sort of be like. So in a way, getting to talk to him face to face at the Hayward Air Rally sort of solidified in my mind that this was going to be a good decision to just go over to Sacramento and do the CFI training there. Now, at the time, you had to be a 2-year CFI or have a certain amount of hours to actually instruct another CFI applicant, which would be me in this case, and he didn't meet those requirements. So the person who would be signing me off for the check ride was actually a good friend that I had met that had also been working there at that same flight school. We've known each other for a number of years. We've flown on the flight sim together. Haven't done a lot of flying in real life together, actually. We probably had more hours on the flight sim together than in real life. So I was kind of pumped to be able to fly with him as well. But that was going to be the kind of scenario that I was getting myself into. I would be flying with the CFI that I met at the Hayward Air Rally, and I'd also be flying with my primary instructor, who was also coincidentally going to be one of my great friends that I've known since getting into aviation. I think we met when I was like 17 or something at a separate aviation summer camp. So in July of 2024, I got myself over to Sacramento Executive and I started taking my first flight lessons for the CFI certificate. Shortly after beginning training with the person that I met at the Hayward Air Rally, I got in contact with another CFI applicant that was basically in the same spot I was. We were both training for the CFI certificate, and we kind of worked out a plan for us to fly together where the both of us would get to act as a flight instructor for each other and get some hands-on teaching experience. So how it would work was we would both sit in the aircraft. Someone would be in the right seat, which is actually the seat you need to be in to do your CFI training and to take your CFI practical test. The other person would be in the left seat, and the person in the left seat would be acting as the student pilot, while the person in the right seat would be acting as the instructor pilot. So we'd go out and fly. The person in the right seat would be controlling the aircraft most of the time, unless we were actually practicing teaching a student a maneuver. But the person in the right seat would do the maneuvers, do the landings, takeoffs, everything that was required by the ACS, or the Airman Certification Standards, which is basically our rubric for our test. So we'd go out and practice, and then we'd land at an airport, switch seats. So now, for example, if I was flight instructor to begin with, I'd now play the role of the student. My friend would go into the right seat and pretend to be the flight instructor, and now he would go out and do the maneuvers, do the landings, and do everything that was required. The big thing that this accomplished was it cut out the need to actually have a certified flight instructor on board helping us. We kind of just helped each other out. And of course, we didn't do this right away. We flew with a certified flight instructor first and got the basics down. And when it was time to just do that repetitive practice that you sometimes need to prepare for a check ride, that is when we started trading seats like this, and it really helped cut the cost down. We'd split the rental fee for time we both act as pilot and command, and it just worked out super well. Not only that, but I learned so much from this guy and watching his way of doing things. We each had kind of slightly different ways to do very minute things, and he had tips that I still take to this day with me. And I also gave him some tips as well on how I do some of the maneuvers and whatnot. Overall, it was just such a productive time, and I'm super glad that I got to do it this way. I would recommend to any CFI applicant out there, if you can find an arrangement like this where you can kind of buddy up with another CFI applicant and just go out and fly together, I feel like it's going to be super beneficial for you. It definitely was for me and for my friend that I flew with. You really get into the mindset of teaching someone else that's maybe not your primary CFI, and I feel like that could be super helpful. So my friend and I continued to fly from July all the way up until October. In between, I would do flights with my primary CFI as well as my CFI that I met at Hayward, and they would kind of validate that what I've been doing with my CFI applicant friend, it was the correct way of doing things. So we'd have these check flights in between to make sure we weren't straying too far off course, which could be a bad situation, if we kind of lead each other off course and do things the wrong way. But at the same time, we're training to be flight instructors, so we know how to find the Airman Certification Standards. We kind of knew what the goals were for every flight that we did together. We were very specific, like, hey, we're gonna go out and do the maneuvers today, or we're gonna do these specific maneuvers, or maybe, hey, I just want to work on my landings today, let's do the landings to these standards. And speaking about the standards too, this was a really good practice for me because at the time I wasn't too familiar with what the actual ACS standards were supposed to be for private and commercial. And what was super beneficial for me was going out and briefing beforehand, like what the goals are, what the standards are for the landings. And this was something that my friend was really good at. So credit to him. I finally managed to learn the correct ACS standards, which is something you need to know kind of off the top of your head as a CFI, because you're going to be actively training private and commercial students to these standards. If you don't know what the standards are, then how are you supposed to provide the right training and ensure that they're hitting these standards and gonna pass their check ride? So that was super beneficial. But trying to keep myself on track here, during the July to October stint where I would fly with my friend and do the check flights with my CFI, I also did a couple of other things. I did my spin training, which had to be done with an official 2-year CFI because I needed an endorsement sign off for that. And the spin training was super fun. I had a great time. Some of you guys may know that I have prior aerobatic experience. I got aerobatic experience during my private training, which I have to say was just so valuable to have that experience during the private training. I mean, that's something that not a lot of people get the opportunity to do, and I'm still to this day super thankful for that. So spin training was a breeze. I wasn't scared of it. I knew what the recovery procedure was just right off the top of my head, and it was really fun actually. On top of that, way back in July, I started doing the the ground portion of my training, this was mostly self-study. I downloaded lesson plans from a source that basically puts the lesson plans together, so I have to say I did not put my own lesson plans together. I know there's a lot of opinions on whether you should, whether you shouldn't. I don't really have much say in that. For me, it was just easier to kind of download them and review them thoroughly, which I did do. For someone else, it may be more beneficial for them to put it together. They may be more skilled in doing that, and if you put your own together, the benefit is you obviously, I think you would know the material way more in depth, because I mean it's you who put them together, as opposed to me having to study my own lesson plans pretty much and make sure I was familiar with them. So there is something to say for that. But what I would do is basically go through my lesson plans lesson by lesson, making sure that I understood all the material. One of the hardest parts for me was the fundamentals of instruction and really getting most of those acronyms down. I know I said I really like the FOIs, and I still really do like the FOIs. They're very important. The FOI written test, studying for that was not a problem at all, but memorizing some of these acronyms was kind of a problem for me. I'm not an acronym guy. There's a lot of acronyms for stuff like the types of stress, learning characteristics, defense mechanisms, and stuff like that I was just struggling with. The acronyms are important, and I just was having a hard time memorizing them. So that would be something that I would have to focus on throughout the training. Aside from that, most of the other stuff I was pretty familiar with already. There was a few things that I did learn specifically regarding maneuvering speed, regarding some weight and balance stuff that I made myself more familiar with. I also really started diving into spins and the aerodynamics behind spins, how you can accelerate or decelerate a spin, basically either speeding it up, slowing it down, what the throttle does in a spin, stuff like that. So I was recommended by another DP, a separate DP than who I used, to study up on spins, and he recommended a great book that I could maybe put a link to in the description that has been super insightful. I learned a lot about aircraft certification standards and how these aircraft are spin tested and whatnot, and I would highly recommend this book to any CFI applicant out there. Study up on spins for sure. Anyway, I worked through my ground stuff. Another thing I forgot to mention was I bought the flight instructor oral exam guide. I'd been using these all through private. So private I bought, instrument commercial I used it for, and I just found that was a good tool for me to do. So I went through the entire oral guide. I made sure to bookmark stuff in a priority level of stuff that I really didn't understand, stuff that I sort of didn't understand, and then stuff that was super easy, which I marked with green. So I ran through that probably 2 or 3 times, and the whole time I just kept refining my teaching skills through the flights, and then reviewing my ground stuff, kind of self-study. I did wish that I spent more time on the ground stuff, and I'll explain this a little bit later. My CFI applicant friend and I did do a handful of mock check rides, essentially ground review sessions, where we went through all the particular stuff regarding the CFI, for example, the fundamentals of instruction, and then we also went through all the basic knowledge that you're supposed to know for, private, commercial, all of that. So we were kind of checking to make sure our knowledge base was there, and I felt like I did okay, but again, I made a mental note that the FOIs was something that I was starting to display as my weakest point, essentially the weakest link in my chain of knowledge is a good way to put it. My applicant friend did super good on the ground stuff. I felt like I learned way more from him than he did from me when we were pretending to teach each other. And he was such a great resource on kind of what I should study for and how I can improve on this ground knowledge. So gotta give props to him for that. He was actually nice enough to let me come over to his house a couple times where we ended up doing mock check rides, and his insights and the way he, evaluated me was just super helpful for what I needed to go back and study on. And there were things I needed to study on in order to be able to pass the CFI check ride, or at least do my best on it. So I continued to keep up the ground practice and the flights, and eventually it was time for me to actually go out and do this CFI check ride. Now I decided to schedule the check ride with a examiner who was involved in the local area at Sacramento. The check ride fee was going to be a total of $2,000 for the initial fee, with $1,000 deposited beforehand. So a couple days before, once we arranged, when the check ride was going to be, I flew out and gave him the $1,000, and then flew back and and continue studying. We scheduled the first check ride attempt for October 30th, 2024. And I can't lie, I was nervous for the check ride. This was going to be my most expensive check ride, but it wasn't something that totally hit me off guard. I was kind of prepared for a figure around like 1600, 17, 1800. So 2000 was just on the high end of that, and I was totally willing to, go out and get it done. You got to do what you got to do. It definitely did raise the anxiety levels that I've had for any check ride. During the instrument and commercial, I always carried some anxiety that the check rides would turn into what happened for the private, and although this was not the case for the instrument and commercial check rides at all, I still had that anxiety creeping back in for this Certified Flight Instructor check ride. And I think that's totally understandable. I mean, we learn about the law of primacy, right? Which basically means that the first experience you have, or the first thing that you're taught, is going to be one of the most well-remembered things, and the private pilot check ride was my first check ride experience, so I have that memory, very solidified in my head, and I think that's probably always going to carry through a little bit. So I feel like that's the main source of my check ride anxiety. In general too, I always just get a little bit nervous when I'm being tested, so the classic check ride shakes, I guess you could call it. I feel like a lot of people go through that. I definitely felt like there was a lot riding on this check ride. I had a lot of people behind me, supporting me. The $2,000 fee played into that a little bit too, and just a large amount of material that I was supposed to remember and be able to pull up. I felt confident enough with it, but I thought that I could be better prepared. And that day, October 30th for the check ride was quickly approaching, so I had a little bit of time to just get everything up to speed and be totally 100% prepared for this check ride. So I went home, did my final bit of ground study, completed I think one final review flight, check flight with my primary instructor, made sure all the endorsements were taken care of. Because it's kind of embarrassing if you go in for a certified flight instructor check ride and you're missing endorsements. Like it's gonna be your job as a CFI. So made sure, double check, triple check that everything was good, triple check that my written tests were not for some reason expired, which they were not, and everything was all good. And it seemed like I was ready to go. So the only thing left really was to get over to Sacramento one last time and take the CFI check ride. Now, anyone will tell you the CFI check ride is no joke. Ask them about the CFI check ride and they'll say that the oral is a long oral. We're talking like 4 hours plus sometimes. The flight's not, too bad. It's not terrible, but the oral portion is a lot, especially if you're going for that initial CFI. It's your first time taking the CFI check ride. You're going to be covering a lot of topics. When we actually take a look at the Certified Flight Instructor Airman Certification Standards, which again is that booklet, you can get in a booklet form or PDF that basically details all the subjects that the examiner has to cover. You'll find that there's around 50 tasks in total in the area of operations. Now I just did a rough calculation, I didn't actually go through and count all of them, so I might be a little bit off there, but roughly 50 tasks. That includes the landings, emergency ops, your ground reference maneuvers, fundamentals of flight stuff, takeoffs, post-flight stuff, basic instrument flying. On top of that, you also have to have your knowledge of the fundamentals of instruction. Remember, that was my weakest link in the chain. You gotta have your technical subject areas down, and this is basically all of your, I would describe it as the ground bookwork for how an aircraft flies. We're talking about weight and balance, principles of flight, aircraft flight controls, the operations of different systems on the aircraft, runway incursion avoidance, how to scan for traffic, navigation, cross-country flight planning. Endorsements are in here now because you as a CFI have to be giving endorsements and logbook entries. We're talking about night ops. We're talking about high altitude operation. We're going to be talking about all the ground subjects that are applicable to you as a flight instructor teaching a private or commercial student, and that is a lot of stuff. So hopefully that gives you a picture of what exactly this CFI check ride is all about. We'll get into the flight portion later. The day before the check ride, I drove over to Sacramento, and my CFI applicant friend was nice enough to actually let me spend the night at his house. So managed to get over there early and grab some dinner before I got there and spent the night at his place. We did some basic review, and I was still lacking in the memorization of some of those acronyms. That was kind of like the one thing that was holding me back, I felt. I did the one thing that you're not supposed to do. I decided to study the night of my check ride and cram. I basically went up into the room and I decided to just get a Quizlet up for some of those acronyms, and I just started running through that Quizlet. Kind of nervous, that I would not be able to memorize them. I mean, I had the references there, but I knew that this guy wanted to have stuff memorized, and I should have had it done a long time ago, but I failed to do it. So I finally thought I got it down. I went to sleep pretty restless and honestly didn't get that much quality sleep. I wanted to be up early because I felt like being awake and giving myself enough time to get over that sleep inertia would be a good thing instead of getting more sleep and then kind of rushing myself to get out the door. So I still got up early and just kind of slowly got myself ready, got myself in the flow of things. I put on a podcast, the CFI, checkride podcast, and just kind of listened to see if there was any final things that I maybe missed out on my studying. And I didn't really pick up on anything that I missed out on. Everything was just information I've heard before, and that kind of gave me a little bit of confidence. I felt that I could pass this test, and even though the anxiety was there, I was kind of getting myself locked and loaded to just go in, put my best foot forward, and get this done. So I showed up to the airport early and I decided to walk out to the airplane. I took pictures of some STC information, which is supplemental type certificate information. Basically, for you guys that are just watching, you guys are not pilots, it's information that is on the aircraft once a big change happens to the aircraft. So in this case, I think we had a different engine on board that was not standard. So we had information that would explain how operating with that different engine worked. So that was information that could come up on the check ride. I took some pictures of that. I also checked the fuel and oil, confirmed that those levels were where I wanted them to be. Basically did a pre-flight inspection right then and there before we started the oral portion. At about 7:30, the examiner showed up and we began doing the IACRA, which is basically the sign-in process to get ourselves started for the check ride. The DPE began checking my prerequisites, so the logbook entries, making sure my logbook made sense and the endorsements in there made sense. Everything was how it needed to be. And then we kind of just started making some small talk, exchanging a little bit of our backstory, nothing too intensive, but just kind of getting a feel for each other. And I had met him previously before, briefly, when we exchanged deposit, but I didn't really get to talk to him that much. So this was really good. Before beginning the check ride, the DP did everything that any DP should do. We reviewed the necessary topics, such as like the pilot's Bill of Rights, the 3 outcomes on a check ride. Basically, you can fail the check ride, you can discontinue the check ride, which means you don't fail, but you just you stop with everything that you've completed and you decide to do it some other day. And the outcome that we all want, the 3rd outcome, is the pass, right? So you can pass the check ride. So we went through all of that. He made it very clear that when he is going to talk to me, he's going to either do it as a pretend student pilot, or he's going to do it as a fellow flight instructor / examiner. So he's going to be either talking to me in those 2 roles, and he said that he's going to try his best to make it very clear what role he's in. So he asked me if I agreed to everything, and I agreed that it sounded like a solid plan to me, and we began the check ride. So before the check ride began, like days before the check ride began, he gave me a scenario that would be playing out during the check ride, and it would be something that me as the quote-unquote flight instructor would have to work with. So the scenario basically went like this. He was going to be playing the role of a student pilot who has not been flying for 30 years, and this student pilot would basically like me to help him get back into flying and also complete his private pilot training. And lastly, he would like me to help him get over his fear of stalls. So that basically clued me in that I would have to definitely have a lesson prepared on stalls. I'd have to have that cross-country flight completely planned out and, ready with each leg in between and whatnot. I really had to be familiar with how to get someone who had all of this in the back of my mind. I tried my best to prepare for that. And then we got into the check ride. So right off the bat, the DPE began presenting this first scenario to me, and pretty much immediately I tried to take charge of the discussion, and I began talking to him in order to try to gain an understanding of what his previous experience level was. So I asked him, pretty directly, I brought up the scenario. I said, you haven't been flying for 30 years. How far did you get into your training? And he told me that he almost got to the point of soloing, but then, life happened and lack of resources and whatnot, and he had to put a stop to the training. So I told him that I completely understood that and whatnot. After that, I asked him what his goals were in flying. You know, is he gonna just be a pilot, or is he gonna go on and get his commercial maybe? And he basically said that he'd like to get his private and then possibly his flight instructor license in the future. So obviously that kind of makes it a little bit difficult there, because it opens up Pandora's box pretty much. You know, he could then ask me any information about anything from the private pilot all the way up to the flight instructor. And of course that's what this check ride is about, so I mean, I can't complain necessarily, but I was like, oh, okay, so basically everything. So that was kind of funny, but I told him that was a great goal to have, and we continued on. At this point, I felt like, you know, I had understood what the student's aviation experience level was and what his preferred outcomes were. And I kind of began just explaining some things that we would have to check in order to make sure he was make sure that he was actually eligible to complete the private pilot certificate. So I asked him about like TSA endorsement, if he was a US citizen, all of that stuff. I asked him about his student pilot certificate. He seemed happy with all of that, and then I started explaining kind of the requirements for the private pilot certificate, the time requirements. So I asked him at the end of my explanation if there were any questions he had regarding this stuff, or if it was all relatively clear, and he said there were no questions. So I thought that we were totally good here. Everything seemed to be flowing great, and we decided to move on. At this point, I just honestly kept going. Like, I just kept talking, and this is one of my big mistakes here, where I should have taken a step back, but I'll talk about it later. I kept going, and I basically said that because he hadn't been flying for 30 years, that I wanted to mention some of the things that have changed over the past 30 years. I thought this would be a good way, you know, to continue kind of the conversation we were having. I just jumped into that. You know, I mentioned that we're gonna go over, or have to go over Part 91 rules, some rules that might have changed. I mentioned new technologies like ADS-B and ForeFlight, and how I'll show him these technologies and how we use them now. So I think he was honestly okay with all of this stuff, and he was kind of just gauging me. Like he wasn't adding a lot to the conversation, he wasn't asking a lot of questions, and this started cueing me in to think that I needed to switch up my the way I was delivering the lesson. You know, when we study for CFI, in the fundamentals of instruction, we learn that there are different ways that people learn. You know, some people are visual learners, auditory learners, but the question I should have been thinking of is, what is this guy's learning style? And am I fitting this guy's learning style right now by just talking to him? So I think at the end of all of this explanation, I asked him if he had any questions again with any of this stuff, and if we were good to continue. And he basically said we were good to go. So from this point, I can't remember if he asked me to just continue on with the stall lesson or how this transpired, but basically I got to go ahead to start with my stall lesson. So I wanted to really engage with the quote-unquote student right off the bat. I started off this lesson by posing a question to the student, and you guys can tell me if this is, you know, right or wrong in the comment section below, but this is honestly a good way that I use right now as a certified flight instructor to start off a lesson. So like I said, you know, you had this fear of stalls develop when you were training. I asked him if he had any particular experience that might have caused this fear to develop. And he responded that when he was with his previous instructor, and again, he's role-playing as the student, right? So when he was with this instructor, all of a sudden the airplane started spinning down during a stall lesson. And, you know, the instructor took controls and started yelling at him. And this experience really made him want to stop flight training. It made him want to discontinue. So I reaffirmed that that must have been a very terrifying scenario to be in. And I also confirmed with him that it was such an intense experience that it almost made him want to stop flight training. So I was just kind of reaffirming his fear in a way there, and saying, you know, that because of that scenario, it's totally understandable that he would have this fear of stalls. But I then explained that the way that we go about reducing the fear of stalls is by understanding the mechanisms behind them, you know, how a stall works, and then practicing them, right? So we'll go out to the flight training area, we'll practice these stalls, and we'll practice how to prevent that spin that he was talking about from happening. So I thought that this was a solid move here. At this point, I loaded up my presentation on stalls, and I began, you know, using my presentation to teach him, kind of assuming that he was a visual learner. And I got pretty far into it. I started explaining how a wing works, you know, what the aerodynamics are behind the stall. I explained angle of attack, relative wind, all of that stuff. kind of going on about like the coefficient of lift. I had the lift drag graph up. If you guys are familiar with kind of it represents the lift that the wing can create up to the critical angle of attack, and then it drops off. So I had that coefficient of lift graph up, and as I was explaining that, I noticed that he was starting to get uninterested. You know, he was exhibiting major signs that he was just not paying attention to the lesson due to his body language, the way he was conducting himself. So I noticed that, and I just flat out asked him. I was just like, hey, you know, I noticed that you might not be really feeling this lesson. Is there anything I can do to present the information better to the student? You know, can I help you out? And it was at this point the examiner stopped acting as the student and basically ended this section of the oral. He took a bit of a pause, and then he stated that my performance was just not satisfactory. The first thing he said was that I didn't ask the student anything past his aviation background, so I didn't really touch into his personal background or cultural background. I didn't ask what his personal do's and don'ts were, and he said that, you know, some people have cultural things where if you use your tone of voice or use certain phrases a certain way, they may not like that, and that can affect their learning. So he stated that because I didn't do any of this, I didn't understand the student's needs before I started the lesson. And therefore, you know, it was kind of impossible for me to teach to the student because I didn't fully understand the student. And that obviously resulted in a failure in the transfer of knowledge, which is kind of a critical thing on this check ride. Another critical thing they mentioned was that when I started conducting the lesson, I never mentioned the lesson plan to the student. You know, I never made it clear really what the goals were, what the objectives were. At a bare minimum, the lesson plan should include, you know, an objective that you want to accomplish, the content that you're going to use, and the completion standards. And that's at a very minimum. You can go even deeper into it and list what the instructor's responsibilities are, what the student's responsibilities are, and whatnot. But the main thing was that I failed to even present what the objective was. You know, I kind of just said that, hey, we're going to go into stalls. I'm going to teach you about stalls. So that was a key takeaway. Everything was a key takeaway, really. But specifically the lesson plan, I carry with me to this day. At the very beginning, when I meet a student, I might not show them a physical lesson plan, but I'm gonna verbalize like, hey, this is what we're gonna be doing, and I do this in our brief. I always do a brief before a flight, even if it's just like a 30-second brief. We kind of already know what we're gonna be doing. I still want to talk to them, make sure that we're on the same page. So I always do a brief, list what the objectives are, what we're going to be doing, and then what the completion standards are. That was something that was a key takeaway for me, but that is how I failed the CFI check ride. He continued in his explanation. He said that regarding the learning styles, he stated that if I had asked the student what his learning style was, he would have told me that he was primarily a visual and tactile learner, and that he really dislikes lectures. So that would have been knowledge that would have armed me to approach that student with his exact learning style in mind. He then asked what style of teaching I was conducting, and I said primarily lecture style, because I had to be honest, that was basically what I was doing for most of it until I pulled my computer out. Although I did begin the lesson by posing a single lead-off question, which should have led to a guided discussion, I really didn't keep the lesson engaging enough with him, and I didn't ask him any further follow-up questions during that lesson to gauge his understanding level, you know, where the student was at. So I wasn't really analyzing if he was actually learning or if we were building those what we call blocks of learning, right? If you're a CFI applicant, you know what I'm talking about. I didn't analyze if any of that was happening. I was basically just presenting the info and then moving on to the next higher level block in the stall lesson. But I wasn't doing any checks to see if he understood, you know, the block that was before it, or basically that foundation. You know, we're kind of building up that foundation of what a stall is. And I was just kind of flowing through the info. So at this point, I sort of knew that failure was imminent. With this much of a debrief going on, I knew that there was basically no hope to redo any of this stuff. And he did make that clear eventually, that this was gonna be a point that we would have to retest. And he said that, he'd be seeing me again. So this is the point where I failed my CFI check ride. And I can't lie, this was incredibly tough. Even thinking about it now, I still get kind of that anxiety that I had. Obviously, this was my first check ride failure, so I really didn't know how to process it. I never had this experience before, and honestly, it was way worse than the private because it kind of like crept up on me and jumped out at me. For the private, I had that thought the entire time during the oral that I was gonna fail, so it was kind of just there, and I knew that I was gonna just have to try my best and push through it. On this one, I thought that I was doing okay. Like, I thought that I was doing great until he started showing that dissatisfaction, and then that's when it hit me like, wow, I did not do a bunch of stuff that I should have done. And at that point it was too late, and it's like I had this realization that I didn't do all of this stuff, and I wanted so badly to just go back, just rewind like half an hour, because we had only been talking for half an hour at this point. Just rewind half an hour and take it from the top and basically ask him all the right questions that I knew in my head right now in this moment. I knew what I needed to have asked him, and that was the part that was killing me. So that was all kind of going through my head. I was thinking already about like, how am I going to retake this test? But we had to still continue to push forward. You have the option. I could have said, hey, let's just call it at this point. But he rightfully gave me the option to continue. I said, let's continue. Let's get as much done as we can. And we decided to continue the lesson. So we continued on. He allowed me to continue my stall lesson. And I did pull out the lesson plan, which I had available. Like, I had it right there on my iPad. I was actually looking at it. I just didn't show it to him. I pulled out the lesson plan. I showed it to him. And at this point, he kind of just brushed it off because, I had already failed on fundamentals of instruction, which is that area of operation. So showing him the lesson plan was part of that area of operation. So he was just like, whatever, you already failed that, just continue on. Now, what I don't want is for this to be a full check ride debrief video. This video is already way too long, and I just frankly don't have the time to cover all of that in this video. I might make a separate video covering the CFI check ride in more detail down to the actual areas of operations in the future. What you need to know is that we did continue with the oral portion of the check ride. We started looking at the sectional chart next, and then we did performance questions, weight and balance, more flight instructor questions that are applicable from all ranges of the areas of operations. We talked about runway incursion avoidance, all of that stuff. And I did come out with some areas where he wanted me to review and come back to him prepared to explain these areas in more detail when I would see him again to talk about the main problem, which was the fundamentals of instruction. So, in conclusion, aside from that FOI failure, most of the check ride went okay. We did have stuff that we needed to come back to besides the FOI, mainly the CG question, the chart symbology, the maintenance question, of which he asked for a full presentation on aircraft maintenance, so I would have to now do a deep dive into part 43 and part 65. And of course, on top of all of that, I needed to go over the fundamentals of instruction. I needed to pay attention to how to teach the adult learner, how to transfer knowledge, how to effectively transfer learning to the student, how to deal with a lack of learner motivation, and everything else that I missed in that first half an hour that I was talking with him. So I got my figurative pink slip printed out with the list of deficiencies, and that was how I failed my CFI check ride. After the paperwork was finished, we began to make some small talk, and towards the end, the examiner said something that really did lift my spirits up and kind of showed that he cared about my situation. He said that he didn't necessarily believe that you can teach someone to be a good teacher. They either have that ability or they don't. And he said that I did have that ability. He said that what I do know, I know it well, and it's only a matter of filling in the holes. And honestly, that gave me so much hope to just go back, put my head down, study up what I needed to study up on, and come back ready to go and kick some ass. Immediately after the check ride was officially over, I went outside, I started talking to some of my friends who were at the flight school waiting there, and I basically filled them in on how it went, what I need to improve on. And of course, they all, kind of felt bad for me. I was noticeably down, of course. But I tried to still keep my head held up high, I tried to just show that, hey, it happens sometimes, I'm aware of that. But it really got to me, just it being the first check ride failure that I would have had to go through. I was still figuring out how I was going to process it, and in those few minutes right after the check ride was done, I wasn't quite sure yet how exactly I was going to process this. After talking with the people in the area, I had to then text everyone who was waiting to hear the news. I had to tell them the bad news, and that was another crushing part of it as well. It kind of goes back to the beginning where I mentioned that during these check rides, you're really kind of representing everyone that has had your back and has been supporting you the whole time. And it just felt like I had completely let everyone down. I think I got something to eat because it was still a pretty long day, and then I began the 2.5 hour drive back home pretty much in silence, mentally going through how I was going to approach the next few months and complete this check ride. Now, I'll just give a brief recap on how I studied up for the second round. After failing on October 30th, I had to fly with my CFI again in November 2024. And after that was all completed, after my CFI had signed off that we reviewed all the deficiencies, I attempted to schedule the retest for December 13th, 2024. Now, the weather was looking kind of bad, so I asked to potentially reschedule the test. And the major question I had was this: when you fail a practical test, you have to retake the test within 60 days ideally. If you retake the test within 60 days, you can receive credit for everything you've done before. However, if you take the test past the 60-day window, then you have to redo the entire thing. So I was unclear on whether the retest attempt would reset this 60-day clock. What I had in my mind was, if the weather was bad and I was only able to finish the oral portion, would I get another 60 days? Or would I then have to rush to reschedule again for the flight portion and potentially risk having to redo everything again, which would cost a whole lot of money with this guy particularly? Really, the question was about money. How much money would I have to spend? This examiner charged $1,000 for each retest. So that's why I wanted this answer to be clear before I, put my foot down and confirmed with him on a specific date. If I could pick a day with good weather, I'd only have to pay $1,000 instead of another $2,000 because I'd have to discontinue. So I had that question in my mind. I didn't want to confirm the date until I really knew what the answer was. So I asked the DP directly what the answer to this question was. And basically through miscommunication, he assumed that I wanted to cancel the check ride and basically confirmed the cancellation himself. I had to go down and meet him in person where we clarified this, that I didn't want to cancel the check ride. And he said that, well, now the closest available date was December 16th. And I said, yeah, let's just do it. I didn't even really know what the weather situation was going to be. But apparently this guy was just really particular about if you get a date with him, you need to stick to it. And I felt like I had no choice. I just stuck with the date and we put December 16th as the day for the second check ride attempt. Now, I just don't have enough time to go into round 2 on any sort of check ride debrief, but the oral went good. His demeanor was totally different. He acted as if he just wanted to really get through the material. There were a couple holdups that I had, but I was able to research them really quickly, find the appropriate regulation or the appropriate information, and give him the answer that he wanted, and I passed the oral portion of the check ride. So I felt really good after passing the oral, looked out the window, and the entire time I knew this was going to happen, but the field was IFR. It never went VFR, so we had to discontinue this second check ride attempt due to weather. So now we're up to 1 failure, and today 1 discontinuance. So basically my money nightmare came true, and I would be discontinuing and paying another $1,000 when it was finally time to do the flight portion of the check ride. Now, although I had just passed the oral portion of the CFI check ride, it felt like there was even more weight on my shoulders because now it would all come down to a $1,000 flight, where if I did one thing wrong on this flight, I would not be able to continue. I would have to pack it up and just try some other time. I felt so mentally drained at this point and financially drained as well that it put an intense amount of anxiety on this final flight. So from December 16th, 2024 to February of 2025, I sort of sat and wait again, continuing to study my stuff and continuing to fly now that I knew that I'd passed the oral and it all came down to the flight portion. I felt very confident about my ability to fly the aircraft. Ever since the private pilot check ride, my ability to fly the aircraft has, in my opinion, always been greater than my ability to go through the groundwork. And not to a large extent, for the instrument and commercial, I had the ground stuff down really well, but at the same time, there's something about being in the airplane for me that really does it. It really just puts my mind at ease, and I just feel comfortable with when I know that it's time to fly. We finally arranged on a date for the flight portion of the check ride. It was going to be February 8th, 2025. And although I had a bunch of people supporting me, giving me tips and good thoughts, I kid you not, I've never felt this amount of anxiety in my entire life. This was 100 times worse than anything I felt during the private check ride, during the lead up to the instrument and the commercial check rides. This was a new experience for me and something that I had never been through before. My mindset totally switched from assuming that I was gonna pass to basically being mentally open to the thought that I would fail this flight portion of the check ride. It almost felt like some sort of resignation now that I look back on it. I tried super hard to do everything that I could to get that confidence that I needed before I got to the airplane that day, but it just wasn't happening. I told very few people about the check ride. I didn't mention it to most of my friends and even some of the CFIs I was working with. The only people that really knew the exact date was my mom and a few close friends that were backing me up during the entire process. I just couldn't bring myself to tell people about it because, again, I had gotten into that mindset where I couldn't find the confidence to say that I would 100% pass this check ride. And I didn't want to hype it up and then have to tell people that I failed the oral portion and now I just failed the flight portion. So I ended up deciding to not spend the night at my CFI applicant friend's house, whereas I spent the night for the October check ride and the December check ride. I ended up just booking a hotel and driving myself out there to that hotel. Got there in the evening, got some pizza to eat, and I remember just eating my pizza as the rain was coming down, thinking about the day ahead. And not necessarily thinking about the maneuvers I would have to be doing, but just thinking about what if I failed? Maybe I'll pass. What was it really gonna be like? I started genuinely having thoughts about if I was doing the right thing, if the entire process would have been different if I were to have done it in Wyoming or somewhere else, and all of these thoughts just continued to creep into my brain as the rain was falling down. Eventually, I managed to calm myself down a little bit. I did some basic pre-flight stuff for the flight that I would have tomorrow, and I did review some of the standards for the maneuvers that I would be performing. I went to sleep and I managed to actually fall asleep a lot earlier than I did for the initial CFI oral, so I did get more sleep and this was probably something that really helped me a lot. I woke up feeling okay, but again the anxiety just started really creeping in. Thankfully the weather had turned VFR, the rain had stopped, but the ground was still a little bit moist. I put in my earbuds in the hotel room. I began listening to some music instead of a CFI podcast, and I began to just try to hype myself up for this flight. Again, I got to the aircraft early. I was able to make sure the airplane was fueled up and ready to go. And I finally met with my DPE. We went into the office and we did a quick brief of everything that was going to happen, all the maneuvers, the standards, whatnot. And I could tell that his demeanor was a little bit more positive today. He was almost excited, I want to say, for the flight. And that helped calm me down a little bit. I walked out to the aircraft, I took the chains off. It had already been pre-flighted, but I still did a walk around just to show him that I can do it. It's part of, the ACS, so still did my walk around just as I would if I had not checked anything. And he asked me some basic questions about some stuff, and I was able to answer it thoroughly and completely, and there were no problems there. I took the chains off, and what really changed everything for me was when I sat in that right seat. As soon as I sat in that right seat, it was like all the confidence that I had been looking for came right back. I have always taken pride in being pilot in command when I need to be pilot in command, and this is one of those situations where I was pilot in command for this flight, and I was going to be doing my best to be the best instructor I could be for this quote-unquote student. When I sat into that right seat, I'm telling you, it was like a switch had flipped, and I just began going full instructor mode. I began verbalizing everything I was doing, running through the checklist. We got the aircraft started up, and I got my taxi clearance, and we taxied out. And again, I don't want to turn this into a CFI check ride debrief, so I'm just going to say the maneuvers all went great. The maneuvers were well within standard. The examiner took over and flew a ground reference maneuver. He did a turn around a point. I talked him through it. He also, I believe he did some stalls or some slow flight, and I gave him some pointers there because sometimes these examiners, when they're pretending to be a student, in the check ride flight, they will purposefully not fly as good. So they're kind of looking for you to catch some mistakes and whatnot. And I caught the mistakes that he ended up making and corrected him on it. And he was just very happy with all of that. There was nothing negative about this part of the flight at all. We eventually worked our way through all the maneuvers and it was time for the landings. I did all of the landings within standard, and it was finally time for the power off 180, which again is a commercial maneuver, but CFIs have to do it from the right seat. You guys already know how my commercial power off 180 went, so I'll just tell you, this one did not go as well as the commercial one. I was hot and high, which basically means fast and high, so I had excess energy in the aircraft, and I had to put it in a slip the entire time, all the way down to the runway, I believe with flaps 22. I didn't want to be low, you know, so I kept myself high, but I just turned into the runway sooner than I should have. And this was the only time on the check ride where that anxiety crept back in, and I was worried that I was about to fail the check ride and have to redo it. Now, I kept the slip in for literally as long as you possibly could without the wheels touching the ground and sideloading the wheels. At the very last second, I kicked it out. We were probably like a foot off the ground. I touched down at the very end of where I needed to touch down, and the examiner looked at me and he said, well, that was not the best that I've seen, but it was within standards. And at that point, I must have let out a sigh of relief. I cleaned up the aircraft, we exited the runway and taxied back, and I was just so relieved that I was practically done with the check ride at this point. And we finally were able to line up on the runway, take off, and head back to our starting airport where we would now finish the check ride. On the way back, he asked if he could take control, and he specifically said he wanted to do this so he could give me some time to breathe and relax. I really appreciated this, and I gladly said, your controls, and handed the controls over to him. He began flying back, and I think he gave me some pointers and tips here just on basic CFI stuff, you know, nothing pertaining to helping me with the check ride. He just, you know, made some small talk here and there, and I thought that was pretty cool. Eventually, we got close to our airport, and I started tuning in the frequencies to contact the tower. He then briefed that he would like me to teach him how to land the aircraft, and basically he said that if I don't tell him to do something, he's just not gonna do it. So he wanted me to be very specific in my instructions and take him down to the ground, and I did exactly this. He made one comment that at one point I wasn't speaking loud enough into the mic for him to understand me clearly, so I just increased my tone and my volume, and I got us onto the ground, instructing him on how to do the landing, being very specific on like feet per minute, descent rate, speeds to follow, when to put the flaps in, when to turn. All of that is what he wanted. We finally got onto the ground, he gave me the controls back, and I taxied us back to our parking spot. And this is where I really felt a huge relief. And once I got the engine shut down, he shook my hand right then and there, so that was already a difference than the private check ride. And he said, congratulations, you did well, and you're now a certified flight instructor. And he gave me some congratulatory remarks. We did a very quick debrief just sitting in the cockpit there, and he had me secure the aircraft and then told me to meet him in the office. Now, I had some time alone by myself here, and honestly I felt like I would just break down and cry at this point because I'd been through so much already, but that's really not what happened. I guess that's just not the kind of person I am. I tend to hold in the emotions perhaps a little bit, so didn't cry or anything. I just put the aircraft away. I took one look at the aircraft and I managed to record a little bit of video, and then I started walking back to the office. In the office, he gave a more thorough debrief. He gave me some pointers on some minor stuff that I could maybe focus on when I was actually teaching people, and he gave me my temporary airman certificate to sign. I cannot express how happy I was to receive that temporary airman certificate. It meant so much to me. I got a quick picture taken for the flight school that I did all my training with, and then I walked outside and made some small talk with my now fellow CFIs, which was just such a cool experience to have. They were all super happy for me, and I felt a lot of pride now, and I felt very confident in texting everyone that wanted to know, how the situation went. I texted everyone that I had finally passed the CFI check ride, and everyone was just super happy. I was super happy. It was just a great feeling to have finally done the CFI training and passed the CFI check ride after everything that had happened. So in total, it took me 1 year, 2 months, and 6 days from having passed the Fundamentals of Instruction written test. And I can now proudly say that as of February 8th, 2025, I am now an official certified flight instructor. Since February 2025, I've started working as a independent certified flight instructor up here in the NorCal area. I've had a ton of experiences, and I just can't describe how much fun I've been having recently. I've always wanted to be able to teach aviation, and this goes back to, the reason why I started this YouTube channel in the beginning was to just kind of recap my own flights, but it's always had that air of education to it, and now I can officially use this YouTube channel as a way to kind of communicate thoughts that I have on aviation safety and how to fly airplanes, which at the end of the day, I love flying airplanes. I love now being able to teach people how to fly airplanes. It's definitely one of the greatest achievements I've ever made in my life, becoming a certified flight instructor. And I'm just super happy to keep going at it and see what the world of aviation has to offer for my future. So at the end of the day, when we look back and ask ourselves, what does failure really mean? I think I have a good answer for that now. Failure to me is one of the best learning experiences you can have in life. As cliche as it sounds, failure is a chance for growth. It's a chance to pick yourself back up and try again. And frankly, whether you pick yourself back up or allow yourself to stay down is a decision that you have to make on a personal level. I'm glad that I made the decision to get back up, and I'm so grateful that I had a community of friends that were standing right behind me to help me study and to give me the motivation that I needed to get this done. I couldn't have done it without each and every one of you. It's hard for me to say this without seeming like I'm contradicting everything that I've said up to this point, but I really did learn so much from the CFI experience. Forget the discontinuance, forget the anxiety. I think that going through that checkride failure has done two things that I have tangibly noticed in my approach to dealing with actual students. The first one is I feel that it gives me a little bit more empathy towards the student pilot. When I hear that someone has failed a checkride, or someone is struggling with an instructor, or they're maybe just struggling on their own through the material, I can understand what they're going through. I can understand what failing a checkride feels like now. And I think that makes a small difference if your CFI has been through a checkride failure like that, as opposed to one who has breezed through everything and kind of assumes that this knowledge should be easy to come by. For some people, the knowledge required to operate these heavy machines, these aircraft, it doesn't come second nature. It doesn't come easy, and it takes time and effort to understand. And for you CFI applicants out there, all I can say is that this experience has taught me that you need to cater to your students specifically and help each individual student along on their way to becoming a private, commercial, whatever pilot they want to be. And you cannot do that if you don't understand the students' needs and cater to their style of learning. The second thing that I learned from this entire experience applies specifically to check rides. This entire experience really emphasized the need for me to really study the groundwork and understand the check ride that I'm going into. And it translates into how I teach students to prepare for check rides as well. Any CFI would never send a student into a check ride unless they 100% felt that they were ready to pass that check ride. But I think that this experience has led me to put more emphasis on the mock oral exams that we do, as well as the mock flight exams. When I do mock check rides with my students, some of them describe me as a really tough examiner, and I always tell them that you're gonna thank me when you're in the check ride and they're not as tough as I am. I had the private pilot check ride experience that I talked to you about, and I had the CFI experience as well, and if anything, those two experiences combined together to really just emphasize the need to get ready before you take the check ride. So that's really all I have to offer. If you guys have made it to the end of this video, I want to thank you guys for watching. I have no idea how this video is going to perform. That's not the reason why I'm doing this. This channel has, again, always been about documenting my journey through aviation, and this was such a huge part of my journey. I think you guys who have stayed to the end can see that I just had to keep the format simple and put my words that were on paper into a video, and hopefully you guys can get something out of it. That's really all I have to say. I want you guys to keep flying, stay safe, and you know what? I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.